The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released in 1974 and has become one of the most critically acclaimed horror films ever. It was noted for the oppressive atmosphere, terrifying characters, and the broader social themes that it deals with. Its sequels have received less recognition, but my question today is, how well do they fit the franchise and live up to the legacy of the original? There are 5 categories that contribute to this: atmosphere, scares, characters, villains, and greater themes. Each category can have up to 1 star, bringing the grand total of 5. The original, obviously, has full marks in all areas, as it is the most Texas Chainsaw Massacre it could be. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 was released 12 years later, after the studio pestered Hooper to make a sequel. He decided there was no way to do a simple follow-up, and there had to be a different take. To that end, 2 is more of a comedy, embracing the subtle humorous elements from the original, bringing them to the forefront. There's also more gore, more violence, and enough 80s that it's basically injected directly into the viewer's veins. The film is 1 part remake, 1 part sequel, and 1 part deconstruction. It creates a world that is over the top in every way, and the final 2 acts of the film are set in an abandoned theme park where the set designers seem to be told bigger, flashier, more skeletons, over and over again, until the Paris catacombs would blush. There are plenty of nods to the original, including the dinner scene, door slam, and even death scenes, as well as musical motifs evoking Psycho. Despite this, it never feels overly referential, and manages a very fine line. The atmosphere created is very different, as matching up with the decade it was released in, everything is over the top. There's not the same aura of repression, and even when the heroine, Stretch, is kidnapped, there's not the same feel of danger. If this were the first film in the franchise, the atmosphere is incredible, something that is practically unique among the genre for the sheer insanity presented. But, considering it is part of the wider franchise, it is only 1/2 Saw. The horror, on the other hand, is still front and center. While there are comedic elements, it never takes away from how traumatic the circumstances are, or the genuine fear created from Chop Top as he presses Stretch for information. The film is all about her relationship with the men in her life, and the grim reality that creepers and rapists are out there, and that is very much at the forefront. In some ways it ties into deeper and more common fears than the original, and in that way it could be more effective. It's a full 1 Saw for the rating. Next we have the characters. The main character, Stretch, is a radio DJ, but she hopes to do much more. She takes initiative, heading out to find the detective investigating murders, and even after suffering the aggression of Leatherface, she heads out to confront him. In the end, she is the one doing the chainsaw dance and displaying her strength. Compared to Sally, she's a very different final girl, but cut from the same cloth. There are a few minor characters, but the main other protagonist is Lefty, the uncle of Franklin and Sally from the first film. He has been after revenge for over a decade and is the Theseus of the story, gathering up weapons in the form of chainsaws to slay the foul minotaur that is Leatherface. He's over the top and spends about a third of the film running around chainsawing beams, but it's hard not to root for him as he screams about evil being destroyed. They are a full Saw. More important than the heroes, though, are the villains. And in addition to Leatherface and the cook, we have the newcomer, Chop Top. He's an insane Vietnam veteran who spends his first scene picking at an open wound with a hot wire hanger. He carries around the corpse of his brother, Nevins, the hitchhiker from the first film, and is even more crazy than the typical Sawyer. The portrayal is equal parts terrifying and fascinating, as it's clear the experience in the war destroyed any semblance of sanity that he may have once had. Leatherface in this film has grown up from the childlike defender of the first film and is now a horny teenager. It's a new kind of horror, and is a natural evolution for the character, especially given the new world. In the same way, the cook has now become a capitalist, praying to the one above all, the almighty dollar. He is also an asexual icon, dismissing relationships out of hand. Each has an important part to play, and bounce off the others in an incredibly interesting way. They deserve a full Saw. Then there are the wider social themes. As stated before, the whole film is basically a journey of how men treat women, and how destructive and manipulative it can be. The metaphors are far from subtle, but it still doesn't feel heavy-handed or preachy. There is, of course, also the cook with his capitalist rants about how the little guy gets taken advantage of, taken in the ass by big business. Again, not subtle, but it doesn't need to be. The whole film can be seen as a criticism of even the concept of making a sequel to TCM, with again the cook saying, "It's what the people want," in reference to more and more excess in all regards. That's just scratching the surface, but it's fair to say there's a good deal of depth to a seemingly carefree comedy. Again, a full Saw. So the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is awarded 4.5 Saws. It's an incredible sequel that offers a different take on the concept, while still admiring what came before and enhancing it. It keeps the thrills, kills, and skills due to also being made by Tobe Hooper, and to subvert expectations in almost all aspects, but manage the absurdity and excess in a tightrope walk. While it wasn't well received at the time, it's become a cult classic and is a worthy successor to the original. Leatherface, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, was made 4 years later, after the rights swapped over to New Line Cinema. Even before they had a script or an idea, they produced a teaser showing Leatherface being gifted a chainsaw from the lake. Unfortunately, this film, more than any other, was hit hard by the MPAA and had to be censored, reducing much of the gore and producing a new ending that makes no sense. In terms of atmosphere, 3 tries its hardest not to be 2. It's not funny in any way, ditching any of the subtle black comedy from the first and trying to be dark and gritty. There are instances where this works, but largely it's missing the spark that made the original great. It's a very dark film, and that most of the middle half is out in the woods in the middle of the night, and it's hard to see just about anything. There's certainly some oppressing moments, but unfortunately the cast comes off more like caricatures than characters, and even the grim realities come up short. The film being shot in California instead of Texas certainly doesn't help. This is half a Saw. The scares are impacted in the same way, and that there's virtually no tension or horror. The film tries to use music to replace intensity, and falls short in every regard. Even when Leatherface is chasing a character, it feels lifeless, and coupled with an incredibly dull middle half of the film, all tension is gone. Michelle, the final girl, spends so much of the film tied up, or otherwise incapacitated, but nothing happens to her. Then in the final scene of the film, an unfortunate late addition, it turns out that a character previously thought to be dead is miraculously alive, erasing all thoughts of danger. There's just nothing here, and as such, zero Saws. For our main character, we have Michelle as the final girl, and her boyfriend Brad. Brad is incredibly annoying and poorly acted. Michelle is better, but is unfortunately trapped by the script, and though she gets the final kill of the film, she spends much of it either wandering through the swamp or tied to a chair. Benny, on the other hand, is a survivalist who takes matters into his own hand, murdering multiple Sawyers with a machine gun, and in general, being a badass. He is great, and just like Poochie, the audience is always asking where he is when he's not in the scene. Even if the non-Bennies aren't great, the audience still cares about them, giving this a full Saw. The villains introduce a new cast of Sawyers, including Tex, played by Viggo Mortensen, Tinker, Alfredo, and Mama. There is also Leatherface's child, who brings up a whole host of uncomfortable questions that are better left unasked. Leatherface is back to being more of a brute in this one, and the household duties are passed around to the other members of the family. Tex is the center of the show and is somewhat entertaining, but not nearly as intimidating as he's trying to play. Ultimately, none of the new cannibals are particularly interesting, though the conflict between them at least keeps the attention. Enough for half a Saw. Finally, the greater themes. There just really aren't any. In a lot of ways, the film is a soulless cash grab, trying to use the chainsaw name to bring in profits after Freddy stopped bringing in the dollars. I wish there was more to it, but ultimately, there's just nothing there. So the total is 2 Saws. It's like a flesh mask for the franchise. Sure, it looks the part. There are all the elements there, but you peel it off and it's just a lifeless husk. It says a lot that teaser trailer was created before there was anything to the film. They wanted to make a movie without a movie, and this was the result. There's also unfortunate cuts that had to be made due to the censorship. The better kills would do little to help the rest of the film. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Next Generation, was surprisingly next. Though it was originally known as Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the first release was small and unsuccessful. Later, the 2 stars, Renee Zellweger and Matthew McConaughey, had blown up and a new cut was made and set loose to theaters, to even more failure. There's very little good in this film, although there is a certain charm to the awfulness. All of the acting is a mix of over the top and bad, and in one of the more bizarre takes on the franchise, it turns out the whole family is working for the Illuminati. This isn't just thrown in there as well. It's Vilmer, McConaughey's whole stick, as he talks about how he has to cause terror and create victims. It's some parts parody and deconstruction, but failing at both. Leatherface is no longer a brutish killer, but a whining child and a screaming damsel. It's no longer just the victims who yell, but just about everyone. The family has fallen on such hard times that they order for pizza rather than make their own barbecue, and even when killing, no one seems particularly enthused. As a whole, it's a baffling disaster that is unfortunately dull through much of the runtime, as far too much focus is on teenage drama. In terms of atmosphere, it's virtually non-existent. One of the characters makes a comment about how dark it is, but in response to criticism of the previous film, it's practically daylight. There's no grime or grit, and certainly no sense of dread. The only emotion it creates is one of confusion, and thus, no Saw. The scares are likewise lacking, though it may be intentional. There's so many attempts at comedy that it almost forgets to even try to be horror. It's like someone tried to remake the second film without ever seeing it, but merely hearing about the concept. This will be a common theme in later sequels. Either way, no scares means no Saw. In terms of characters, what they lack in personality, they make up with general shittiness. They all hate each other and love to talk about it.
Look, my father's a doctor, okay? I think I know what I'm talking about, so fuck you, Jenny.
In addition to being duller than a couple of boards, Zellweger is the best of the bunch, in that she's not aggressively annoying, and despite some baffling line reads,
No, he's out there with a chainsaw.
manages to make you root for her. It's generous, but this is half a Saw. As for the villainous cast, technically in this film they are the Slaughter family. There's McConaughey's Vilmer, and then Darla, a presentable member who works a regular 9 to 5, W.E., and Grandpa. They're a vaguely entertaining lot, although as stated before, Leatherface is reduced to whining child, a regression from past films, though there's a lot less malice to them, and even when they are torturing people it seems not quite as cruel, just sort of mean-spirited. Finally, there are the greater themes, or influences. As stated before, there is a fairly large subplot about how the family is sponsored by the Illuminati, as one of their numbers shows up near the end to tell them all how much of an awful job they're doing. This is sort of a meta-commentary on the film, and he even shows up at the very end to apologize directly to the audience about, well, everything. There's even a strange vision where Sally from the first film shows up in a hospital bed, despite the timeline not matching up at all. Overall, not much is said, but there are at least a few decent ideas, enough for half a Saw. So overall, the next generation is looking at 1.5 Saws. Missing any sort of scares or even thrills from the original, but at least keeping some elements alive. While it's probably a worse movie than some of the future films, viewing it from a so bad it's good perspective can lead to some decent fun. Alcohol is suggested, however. With the original quadrilogy done, it's time for a remake, and in 2003 it was released, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. One word for chainsaw, not two, technically making it a different title from the original. Though later remakes, like Nightmare or Freddy, would stick to the same sort of script, this one deviated significantly in terms of story and characters. The style of filming is also that digital 2000s era, which can't come close to recreating the original's realism, though it certainly tries. It's actually a common theme throughout the film. It's trying very hard to be as good as the original, but it just can't reach the same heights. One part it does do well, however, is showing the heat of summer. The movie is incredibly drippy, be it sweat, blood, or spit. Almost every character has their own moment of slop, but despite this, it still feels too clean and manufactured. It's just not possible to replicate the snuff house feel of the original with the style of digital film they were making, and even going so far as to remake the individual shots just isn't enough. It's one half of a Saw. For the scares, there are some actual moments of tension. The family is intimidating, including a forceful presence by R. Lee Ermey as the sheriff, and there is this fear that violence could erupt at any moment. Unfortunately, when it does, there's a bit of a letdown, and the cuts for an R rating are clear. There's also the unfortunate trend of using music, or strings, to replicate actual scares. It's not the worst offender by far, but it's definitely a downside compared to the atmospheric score of the original. One half Saw. The characters are the least memorable part of it. There's some deception early on by the boyfriend, as they were smuggling marijuana and hiding it from the final girl, but this comes to nothing. They aren't annoying or objectionable, just incredibly boring. Despite this, the acting is fairly decent, and when bad things happen, it does work emotionally, because generally they're decent people, enough for half of a Saw. The villains, now the Hewitt family, consist of Leatherface, the sheriff, Luda May, Old Monty, the Tea Lady, Henrietta, and Jedediah. A fairly large cast, though some are less homicidal than others. The sheriff is definitely a standout, a sadistic drill sergeant that chews the scenery and spits it out like tobacco. Leatherface is intimidating here, but loses something from earlier portrayals, as he's missing his sense of innocence or fear. Overall, they only get half a Saw, missing the true madness needed for a full one. For greater themes, it touches on the same as previous films, but very lightly. The new element would be police brutality, though aside from displaying it, there's nothing really said, especially given it's clear that he's not the real sheriff, but just took it upon himself. In this film, it doesn't even seem like they're cannibals, which is a very odd choice. With no real depth to anything, this is 0 Saws. So ultimately, the remake ends up with 2 Saws. It's very middle of the road. While definitely a better film than the 2 that preceded it, there's no heart or soul to it. There are a few good shots, especially one that runs through someone's head, but the rest is a mangled corpse, reassembled to look like a real boy, until the whole thing falls apart, and only sawdust empties from its veins. The natural progression from a remake is a prequel, so 3 years later, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Beginning, was released, and what is likely the least necessary origin story. It begins in the hotel from My Name is Earl, and continues with that amount of effort to put in to show that it's the 1960s. A pair of brothers are on a road trip, but there's drama, as one of them is a vet and the other is a draft dodger, and there's some mix-up with some bikers, and then they meet the Sawyer family, and things, surprisingly, do not go well. In terms of atmosphere, it feels less like the original than the remake, and is bathed in 2000s filmmaking. There's no real sense of place or feel to the environments, and it's just a generic country house, rather than a malevolent place that it should be. By virtue of being a prequel, it loses a lot of the lore that was built up before, and the sets just seem so plain. This deserves no Saw. The scares, on the other hand, are entirely dictated by musical stings. There's not a single moment they want you to be scared that there isn't a loud noise. It's infuriating, and takes away all tension or fear. While there is some torture in other moments, it's just dull, with no stakes, or anything but mean-spirited nonsense. This is negative one-half Saw, and I can't stand the over-reliance on sound effects, especially compared to the original. The characters are your average protagonists from one of the sequels, not worthy of being hated or loved, or even really remembered. They're two brothers and their girlfriends, and they certainly have names, but because it's a prequel, we know they all die at the end, so the whole thing feels rather pointless. No Saw. The Sawyers are missing some of the personality they would later gain, and it's basically the same cast as the remake. Arlie Ermey as the sheriff is trying his best, but it's hard with the material he's working with. Leatherface as well is again a mindless killer, and missing any of the personal touches or heart that make him a great villain. The step down's very noticeable, and this is zero Saws. In terms of themes, the Vietnam War is front and center, whereas it was an undercurrent in the original. Instead of the subtle commentary on the state of the country, it's a loud drill sergeant proving how American he is. There's some discussion about PTSD that's about as subtle as a punch to the face, but compared to the brick to the head that is the rest of the film, that's not bad. This is one half a Saw. So that brings the beginning to a total of 0 Saws. I have to say, this was one of the worst in the franchise. There's no need for it, and there was no value in it either. While the musical sting scares are certainly more of a personal gripe than an objective issue, it really brings down the whole film, and there's not much in the first place to bring down. The thing is, though, it still might not be the worst film in the franchise. The chainsaw went dormant for half a decade, but like a curse on Derry, it would always rise again, this time with Texas Chainsaw 3D. This one's actually set in the present day, and it tries its hardest to make Leatherface the protagonist. Is it successful? No. Trying to make the serial killer cannibal sympathetic is always going to be a long shot, and while they try to make all his victims assholes and the true villains be cops, the whole thing is just a mess. It's also home to the second worst line in the franchise, a worthy title. It begins with a summary of the first film, but with jump scares. A bad start, but follows it up with an interesting idea, following on directly from the events of the first film. Unfortunately, they bring in a bunch of random Sawyers so they can have a big gunfight, and then there's fires and explosions because you have to keep people interested. Then we jump to the present day, and the general cast of young people investigating a house, then dying. In terms of atmospheres, it really feels like they weren't even trying. The bad CGI, including the kind of fire effects you'd expect from a student project, don't help. It's not trying to replicate the feel of the original in any way. As this is the 2010s, and horror has to be like Hostel or Saw, with blood, guts, and more blood, but none of it means anything. There's no dread, no creepiness, and no Saws. The same with the scares. While it attempts its own variation of loud noises equals scary, they also have the idea of Leatherface running around at a fair, but he's not trying to kill people, just sort of doing a slow jog. They're also the most obvious setups for jump scares, and then they go for it unabashedly. No subversion, so every time you expect a scare, it's just there. So disappointing, and deserving of no Saw. For characters, most of the cast are the standard idiots, with a side helping of infidelity. Then we have the main character, Heather. She's a Sawyer, and they give you hints at this early on because she's a butcher and makes art out of bones. Do you get it? Somehow this is treated as a big revelation at the end, when they've been yelling about it the whole time. Like the others, she makes terrible decisions and almost gets killed a few times because of it. Also, the 20-something-year-old actress is apparently 39, matching up to the timeline. Finally, she tells Leatherface to, "Do your thing, cuz," bringing the film to a merciful end. That line alone loses points, making negative a half a Saw. In terms of the family, there is none. Leatherface is the only one alive, and he's just a big bruiser again. It's honestly like these new writers haven't even watched the first 4. His mask as well looks like literal shit, and despite being this big imposing guy, there's no presence to him. The real victims this time are the police, or the sheriff specifically, who was the reason for the massacre 40 years ago. Of course, they use the same actor, with no makeup, so it really doesn't look like he's aged a day. Either way, he's cartoonishly evil, because the Sawyers killed people, again almost half a century ago. Such a strange direction to go in, and with no Sawyers, there's no Saw. For themes, again, we go back to police brutality and cover-ups, with a healthy dose of vigilante justice. There are really 2 quadrilogies that make up the Chainsaw franchise, and the modern ones are almost entirely focused on how evil authority figures are. There's nothing new here said, Although when one of the police officers shoot an innocent girl because he was surprised, it definitely reminds me of a number of recent events. Altogether it's worth a half a saw, but it's more like a third, if that. So where does that leave Texas Chainsaw 3D? With nothing. No saws and a whole lot of confusion. Why did they make this film? Why did they leave a hitchhiker alone in their brand new house and trust him with the keys? Why is Pig Mask at a carnival? Why is Leatherface our hero? Are there answers for any of these? No. But tune in next time for another origin story, but this time even stupider than before. So a few years pass, and the studio decided they would really need was an origin story for Leatherface. Out of ideas, they call it Leatherface. The story goes that the Sawyers are busy in their murdering ways when they killed the daughter of local law enforcement. Enraged, but unable to prove it, he takes all their children away and sends them to a group home. Some years later, and they're all grown up, to varying degrees of instability. The whole joke of the movie, though, is that the mute menacing giant is not actually Leatherface. Rather, it's the charismatic lead who has a bit too much taste for violence. Basically, the entire movie revolves around this twist landing, and it really doesn't. It's the whole if it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck, don't tell me it's a chicken, and the dog is a duck. With that ugly business, much of the film isn't even trying to be a Texas Chainsaw movie, as only about 10 minutes at the beginning and the end are even in the same genre. The rest is a Devil's Reject type adventure film, with enough edge to cut a 14-year-old. There's necrophilia, literal shit, and rotting corpses, but all of it lacks conviction. It never goes whole hog like a Serbian film, or similar, but tries to wade in the bog without getting too dirty. And as a result, for much of the film, it's just a lifeless corpse. In terms of scares, there's a modicum of tension distributed throughout, but no true horror. Even the villains of the film are so cartoonishly evil they don't inspire fear, just laughs. It's hesitant to even call it a horror film, as despite some of the aesthetics, there doesn't seem to be that intention. No saw. For our main characters, there's only one consistent protagonist, and that's the nurse. Her personality is that she's nice, and she makes very poor decisions. For the runaways, there's Leatherface and Bud. Bud is the fake Leatherface, and he seems to alternate between helping them and hurting them, and when he's killed, it all just makes no sense at all from the editing, story, or character perspective. All for a twist that's just nonsense. In terms of villains, we have the pair of Ike and Clarice. I had to look up their names, and the Wikipedia page gives a couple paragraphs to most characters, but not a line to Ike. He's crazy and violent. She's violent and crazy. But neither are the true villain, which is Hartman, the lawman who initially took in the kids and later chases after them. He's so evil he slaughters an unarmed civilian. Let's just leave it at that. No one cares, and despite dying to a chainsaw, there are no saws here. Finally, the greater themes. Abuse by authority figures in shitty juvenile homes. If either of these were treated with a modicum of depth, or even attention, it could be interesting, as there is a lot to say about both, but again, there's nothing to come of it, and no saws. One more film, and again no saws. This bears the least resemblance to the original, and someone would not be crazy for thinking it was a different franchise. It could be said that it's exactly what we needed after 7 films of the same thing, including the same scenes, but ultimately, without a decent script or concept, it was doomed to fail from the start. Finally, we have Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022. I already did a video on this one, but I'll summarize it. The film blows. With unlikable and stupid protagonists, a profound misunderstanding about the character of Leatherface and the appeal of the original, and a baffling treatment of social themes, they would be better if they were completely absent from the film. It's also worthy of 0 saws, and has exactly as much place in the franchise as Leatherface does. So that's it. And I have to say, I was expecting a drop-off in quality, but really everything after the second is its own lesson in mediocrity or worse. Even the films that did understand some of what made the original good were unable to recreate it, and to call the franchise uneven would be a high compliment. Still, the original is a masterpiece and one of the greatest horror films ever made, and the second is incredibly entertaining, in many ways more so than the original, and both are highly recommended. If you watched so far, please like, subscribe, and have a great day.